President Biden today mincing no words about what a win for Russia and Ukraine would mean, and how our ally needs more assistance to fend off its invader, or else Vladimir Putin could be empowered to launch another attack somewhere else. With stakes that grave, one might think voting for additional Ukraine funding would be a no-brainer. But the Republican Party of today has followed Donald Trump down a dangerous path, jeopardizing our national security for politics. It was a big deal this morning when 22 Republican senators broke with their party, voting for critical aid for our allies, Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. The $95 billion national security package now heads to the House, where its future is uncertain. Trump and his congressional allies opposing these funds for our allies, along with the former president's shocking comments, absolutely shocking comments this weekend, encouraging Russia to go after a NATO ally if they do not pay enough, are raising serious concerns that a time could come when the United States' support for allies abroad might waver. Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland remarked on this moment, saying, quote, "Everyone should be scared as hell. Anybody who cares about American leadership, anyone who cares about protecting democracy, anybody who wants to take on authoritarians around the world should be scared to death by the fact that Donald Trump is telling us that if he was reelected president, he would throw our NATO allies to Putin." It's a point worth reiterating. This uncertainty that the U.S. will stand by its allies emboldens the likes of Putin and other authoritarians. We've learned that Russia has put the Prime Minister of Estonia, a NATO ally, on a wanted list because of her efforts to remove Soviet-era World War II monuments. And just last week, we saw Putin, in an interview with former Fox anchor Tucker Carlson, make comments about Poland, another NATO member, that echoed what he said about Ukraine before he invaded. Former ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, has recently said that the alarms over Russia's behavior should ring even louder. In a piece last month discussing his trip to Lithuania, the former ambassador writes, "After meeting with Lithuanian officials, government representatives, and experts from countries in the region, I was struck by how much more long-term they are thinking about the Russian threat than we are in the United States. I heard many of our NATO allies express real fears that Putin is only getting started in Ukraine, that Ukraine could be just the early phase of a new major war in Europe." And that is where we start this hour with former U.S. ambassador to Russia, now an MSNBC international affairs analyst, Michael McFaul. Also joining us, Princeton University professor and distinguished political scholar, Eddie Glaude. And with me at the table for the hour, host of the podcast Fast Politics and special correspondent for Vanity Fair, Molly Jeong-Fast. Ambassador, tell me, when you talk to these leaders, how they are viewing all of this.
Well, first of all, thanks for showing that piece, because that piece was published weeks before Mr. Trump said the comments he did just a couple days ago. But already, because of our debate in Congress, this new isolationist moment we're in, there were lots of conversations when I was in Lithuania. And by the way, there were officials from the entire region there, including Poland, discussing security on the front line vis-a-vis Russia. There were lots of conversations about 2 to 3 years down the road. What if Putin prevails in Ukraine? What happens after that? And the consensus was he won't stop. He'll continue to threaten. There are lots of allusions to the 1930s and what Hitler did in that part of the world when we, again, were in this isolationist moment. And then, as a coda of all that, Mr. Trump says exactly what their worst nightmares are, that if they don't pay up, and by the way, he completely doesn't understand how NATO works, but if they don't pay up, we're not going to defend them. That's exactly what they were fearing before he said those comments. So I agree. Thank you for all the alarms that you just said from yourself and from the others you've quoted. This is a really serious moment in the history of the world, in the history of Europe, and our relationship with our NATO allies.
He doesn't know how NATO works. I'm not sure he cares particularly how NATO works, Ambassador, to just ring one more alarm. And to the point about sort of long-term thinking versus short-term thinking, we've been very focused on this aid package to Ukraine, right? Because that seems to be the thing that is before Congress right now. But when you talk about longer term, what will it require from the United States to protect the world from another potential invasion by Putin?
Well, first is to pass the aid bill. The short term is part of the long term. If, God forbid, that bill does not go forward and that aid package does not go forward, I think historians will look back on this year and this moment as a turning point when we decided that we didn't care about our allies, and we didn't, we put our head in the sands. And I want to just emphasize, we've lived through that in the 1930s when people said it didn't matter what was happening in Poland in 1939. It didn't matter when Japan invaded China. That's not in America's interest. That's where the phrase America first came from, after all, in the 1930s. And we know how tragically that ended. So we should not repeat it again. And we have to be in this for the long haul. That's what deterrence is about. If we're not there, it'll be much more difficult for our European allies to defend themselves against Putin's Russia.
Here's the thing, Eddie. Donald Trump is not in power right now. We are talking about sort of the prospect of Donald Trump returning to power. I want to play some more of the person who is in power right now, President Biden's remarks just this afternoon. And here he is talking about Trump's NATO comments. Take a listen.
Just a few days ago, Trump gave an invitation to Putin to invade some of our allies, NATO allies. He said if an ally didn't spend enough money on defense, he would encourage Russia to, quote, do whatever the hell they want, end of quote. Can you imagine a former president of the United States saying that? The whole world heard it. The worst thing is he means it. No other president in our history has ever bowed down to a Russian dictator. Well, let me say this as clearly as I can. I never will. For God's sake, it's dumb, it's shameful, it's dangerous, it's un-American.
I want to focus, Eddie, on that last point, because there's American security, which is at stake. There's America's role on the world stage. There's also just a values and identity question that is happening in this moment, Eddie.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea that the president of the United States will say or will describe the words of a former president as un-American is actually mind-blowing. In a sense that Donald Trump is not acting in the interest of the United States in this regard. I think it's important for us, Alicia, to kind of interrogate what may be the ideological underpinnings of this move. And I think Ambassador Mafal just kind of alluded to it, right? This America First ideology, this idea of isolationism is rooted in a very insidious view of America, right? That has all sorts of unseemly undertow. And Trump is pushing it. And there are Republicans in the House of Representatives who embrace it fully. And I think if we're very careful, we have to carefully interrogate it, I think, to see Russia's place in this ideology. It's tied to white nationalism. It's tied to isolationism, as he mentioned. But we have to understand the way it fundamentally goes against the post-World War II consensus. They reject it wholesale and no chaser. So I think we have to really understand what's motivating what seems to be just simply Trump running his mouth.
Well, to this idea of America First, Molly, when asked what's going to happen with the bill in the House, you had Speaker Johnson saying, quote, national security begins with border security, which is like their talking points didn't get a refresh after they killed the border security bill. But he actually can't even put it into context or into a framework.
Well, this is a Mobius strip, right? So Johnson says we're not going to protect Ukraine's border unless we protect our own, right? A talking point that someone has cooked up in the RNC. And so Democrats are like, OK, let's do it. And they negotiate this very, very, very tough border bill
that some members of their own party don't even like.
A lot. Yep. And you know, negotiated by James Lankford and Chris Murphy and Kyrsten Sinema. And for 3 months, they bring it out, and Johnson says, I don't even need to read it. It's dead on arrival. And I mean, this is this fundamental problem, right? That they are the burn it down caucus, right? They don't want government to work. Their central thesis is that government is bad, and we'll show you why.
It's also just amazing. I got to say, if I did that much work on absolutely anything, and then one person came in and torpedoed it, I would be very angry, putting principles aside, just the amount of work that was not honored. Here's the thing, Ambassador. This legislative body, they have tried to put constraints on what a future President Trump could do vis-a-vis NATO. The thing is, if Donald Trump were to get back into the White House, he doesn't need to officially pull out of NATO for the alliance not to work. Give me a sense, Ambassador, of what that might look like.
Well, that's right. So I'm glad they passed that and Biden signed into law that legislation about NATO. But it won't matter if one of those countries are attacked or even threaten to attack. Remember, it doesn't take tanks rolling into Tallinn. That's one scenario. But what if there's some kind of military operation in one of our countries in the NATO alliance, and then Mr. Trump, if he's president, says, well, that's not an Article 5 kind of threat. We're not going to do that. We're not going to respond. That's the beginning of the end of the credibility of all of NATO members. An attack on one is attack on all. So it's good that the legislation is there, but it's most certainly not sufficient. Another thing, for instance, he could begin to move our soldiers out of NATO countries. The president has the power to do that. It could be a debate, but he could signal that we are not committed, and that would be another thing that they would do. And then when countries are faced with that, as again, we learned from the 1930s, they start hedging their bets. They start doing deals. In the case in the 30s, it was with Hitler. Now it might be with Putin's Russia. And that is very detrimental to the security architecture in Europe. And finally, the thing that really drives me nuts about this debate, a lot of these Republicans, they say, we got to be tough on China. This is not our problem. But these things are intertwined. If Putin, Russia's ally, in de facto, not de jure, succeeds, that will embolden Xi Jinping. And the idea that looking weak in Europe is not going to signal weakness in Asia, I think is just a misreading of history and a misreading of our moment today.
And